Hello, everyone. I think we'll get started. Hello. On behalf of the Office of Research, I'd like to welcome you to today's Roads to Research. For those in person and those joining us remotely, welcome. Just a couple of notes. There's coffee. Please help yourself, as always. And just a reminder that these presentations are filmed. I wanted to thank our speakers today, Dr. Ronald Lindstrom and Dr. Charlotte Gorley, for taking time to share their presentation with us. They'll talk for about 45 minutes with 15 minutes at the end for questions. And the title of their presentation is, as you can see, C is for Leadership, Exploring Complex Change in the Canadian Health System and a Case Study of Primary Care Redesign in the Fraser Health Region. So please join me in welcoming our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa. So the title is about as complicated or complex as the work we did, which is about as complex as the system we're studying. I feel a little overdressed. I don't usually wear a tie, but I thought, well, Pedro will be here, and certainly he's wearing a tie. Now he's not wearing a tie, but thanks for being here, Pedro, as well. And I'd like to acknowledge Graham Dixon as well. Dr. Dixon is the PI for the project. Thanks, Graham, for being here for this presentation. I appreciate that. And he's, of course, has been instrumental as the PI in making sure that the conduct of research followed protocol, and we certainly have achieved that as well. So why is leadership important? It certainly was important, and that's why we were successful in gaining this grant in the first place. on our first go-around, which, by the way, was quite an impossible job, but we did that thanks to the great number of researchers and decision-makers on our team, and the fact that our topic was very much in concert with the needs of the day back, this is about 5 years ago now. And it's still important, in fact, more important. I was at a invitational leadership healthcare forum in Montreal last week, as was Graham and a number of other people, about 100 people, to look at the issue of health leadership in Canada. More the question, where exactly is it? And John Abbott from the Health Council of Canada sort of put this in this term. There's a leadership problem, and it occurs at least 3 levels: the political level, the clinical level, and the administrative level. And those levels aren't necessarily working together, and there are other levels. But leadership is a pervasive issue in the health system in Canada. And we are, the result of that is that we are rating far below our peer group with other countries in the world. We're amongst 17 peer groups. And we get a B grade for health performance. I don't know if you knew that. We're 10th out of 17. Japan, Switzerland, and Italy are at the top of the scale. The U.S. is at the bottom, perhaps unsurprisingly. Our worst areas where we had C grades were in cancer mortality, diabetes mortality, musculoskeletal mortality, and infant mortality, which I thought was rather surprising. And it really comes down to, with those kind of dismal performances, and we are known to have a very, very good system. And we get a B, there's no question about the level of performance, but we're lacking in many areas, and there's a wide variation across the country. So why is that? And we felt years ago, and it still felt, that leadership plays a huge component in that, and that we need to do a lot more work in the leadership arena to improve those kind of statistics. The other thing about our title here, and I'll explain what the C means in a moment, that was Charlotte's great idea, and it's very catchy and appropriate. We don't really have a Canadian health system, and if you're not in the health system, you might not realize that. There's no national health system. It's really a conglomeration of 10 provinces, 3 territories, the military, the RCMP, and First Nations. So there's probably 17 or 18 different systems. So when you try to lead in a very fragmented, and in this case decentralized, regionalized system, or number of systems, it's very, very difficult. And that was one of the challenges and findings that we found. It's very difficult to lead in that kind of a situation because the products that you want out of that leadership can be very different depending on where you are in the system, whether it's political, clinical, administrative, or even to the patient for that matter. So it's a big deal. And I've already taken up about 10 minutes of my precious time here. Here's all the C's that Charlotte discovered in the in vivo analysis, and why we didn't go with Alice for leadership. Change, coordination, community care, co-leadership, capabilities, Canada. The C grade for mortality is not there, crisis is not there. There's a number of things that relate to leadership or lack thereof. What we're going to do today in our fairly brief time is I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of the Canadian Institutes of Health Research Partnerships for Health System Improvement, that's CHR FISI project, what that actually means. Our own project, and the reason for that is often you will hear, and it's written up in terms of a great project, which this is, but not a lot of discussion about what you went through to get there. And I think that's lacking in the literature as well. So we wanted to just talk a little bit about the process we went through, some of our insights, some of the lessons that we learned in order to perhaps help you if you're looking at large-scale, pan-Canadian, multi-year projects with multiple partners that involve researchers, teams of researchers, and decision makers. And we learned a lot. It was a great project. It's producing what it had intended to produce, and we learned a lot along the way. And I think we would change things, Graham, in our next project. And Charlotte, for the second half, is going to talk specifically about one of the nodes. We had 6 case studies across the country. BC was one of them in the Fraser Health region, hence the title. And she's going to talk specifically about that project and the findings. And then a brief roll-up of the cross-case analysis, which is a lot, so we had to condense that quite severely, and then leave time for questions at the end. Does that sound like a plan? So CHR, the Canadian Institute for Health Research, is comprised of 13 virtual institutes. The one we most closely relate to is the Health Services and Policy Institute. Most of these institutes deal with clinical and basic science, anatomy and physiology in the human world, if you look at it that way. We deal with these 4 pillars. We deal mostly with the health systems and services pillar. Our project was a 3-year project, $350,000 from CIHR, which is the maximum amount we could have achieved. And in partnership with them, $100,000 from Michael Smith, giving us $450,000 in cash. But even as important, a lot of in-kind from our then 20 partners. So the total project was about $0.8 million, which is a pretty sizable project. And I think at the beginning, we're kind of wondering, how are we going to spend all this money? At the end, it's like, where did all that money go? And we also needed another year, but we didn't get another year of funding, so we had to spread out the final 2 years into, final year into 2 years of funding. So our project went from 2010-11 to 2012-13, and we had to add a year. It was actually an automatic extension, which was important because essentially, and that was one of our lessons learned, it takes about a year to gear up the rest of Canada, if you will, from in multiple sites to start the research, including, I might add, when we're dealing with ethics approval across the country. You can imagine how many jurisdictions that we're dealing with. So we experienced all of that, and we're able to achieve that for the most part of the year, which I think is not a bad track record in terms of getting it going across the country. The purpose of the project is to develop leadership capacity. I mentioned why that's important already, and bring together 2 what we call nascent networks. One of those is the Canadian Health Leadership Network, the executive director being Mr. Bill Thal, who is part of this project was the decision maker co-PI and worked very closely with Graham as the decision maker, part of the research decision making team, and did an excellent job in representing the decision maker community through himself as a decision maker, but also through CHLNet, the Canadian Health Leadership Network, in many meetings and presentations that he had made in that jurisdiction as well. So that was important to keep in mind. In terms of the extent to which we involve decision makers. One of the reasons, and an important one, that we were successful in getting the grant was that we had created a team that was comprised of researchers and decision makers. If you don't do that as a robust network, call it partnership, you don't get the grant anyways. And the idea is to further that collaboration and make sure something comes out of that applied research, really looking at questions that are of relevance to the decision makers. So we were really true to that principle all the way through. Again, we want to respond to the whole Canadian health system situation of budget problems, a lot of transformation going on, a lot of innovation, in some cases not going very far. A lot of innovations don't get very far. Leadership is felt to be part of that problem. A demand for new kinds of leadership. A lot of us were, like myself, were trained back at administration days. My degree is a Master's of Science in Health Services Planning and Administration. Leadership wasn't even mentioned. Management wasn't mentioned. We still have a lot of administration programs across the country. They work very well. But it's a bit of a sign when the terminology hasn't sort of kept up with the demands of complexity. So we still have programs for administration, programs for management, and few programs for leadership, including the one here at Royal Roads, which is filling that demand for sort of new conceptions of leadership. And the last thing is a looming leadership crisis. And I think the study has demonstrated that, in fact, if there's not a crisis already, it's certainly looming on the horizon. Just to give you some sense of the construct of the project, and we had to put all of this in our proposal. We had 4 components. One is a steering group, and that was all of the members. We met 5 times in different locations across the country. And this took a fair amount of money. It's about $10,000 a crack, so we spent about $50,000 meeting. However, the face-to-face time was absolutely critical. We could have used a lot more of that, and that's one of the lessons that we learned is unless we're meeting face-to-face as a team, researchers and decision makers, it's very easy to lose the decision maker interest in this because they're not as attached as we are as researchers. We had a secretariat, which had operational oversight. I was the chair of that. We had 43 teleconferences in the past 4 years. So if you take hours of preparation, national meeting time, and the follow-up, we're talking 4 to 5 hours in terms of ratio per meeting. We had a research design group, which looked at content expertise from a research perspective and stewardship. Graham Dixon was the chair of that. We had 34 of those teleconferences, and a KT group, Knowledge Translation, which I chaired as well, which really looked at how do we mobilize the knowledge during the project and at the end. And we've had 5 meetings to date looking at that. Our questions, and I've abbreviated those for the sake of this presentation. What's the state of health leadership capacity? And we do have answers to that in the study. What's working, what's not? And how does the context, the structural factors help or hinder effective leadership? And there's many of those actually that help and hinder. Where are the gaps between practices, the evidence, and what's being done? And there is a huge gap in terms of what the literature says and what's actually being practiced, and people know that. It's a lot different to say what ought to be done as opposed to, and this is how you do it. And we had ample feedback, and I think there's a growing fatigue amongst decision makers that getting a little tired of researchers saying this is what you ought to do, which is fine, but they really do want, and this is how you do it, or at least help with how you do it. And I think we've failed as a research community in doing that, generally speaking, which is really why we need much more applied research and a lot more of the decision-making component on the team to make sure that we're not only addressing the questions that they need to answer, but we're helping them solve them in real time. And thirdly, how do we mobilize all this knowledge? Like I've just said, it's fine to create it, but what do you do with it? And that is really a challenge, and will continue to be one. But we have discovered ways that we can achieve that. We used a participatory action research approach, meaning that we've actively engaged decision makers in their real life problems. They helped us co-generate the questions and the answers and helped us with the analysis of the data. And in many cases, there was a deliberate intervention by the researchers in the actual work of the decision makers. That was one of the things that was different across the country. There was a certain comfort level with some researchers actually actively being part of meetings, like Charlotte was in our BC node, and answering questions and providing advice where asked. The other end of the spectrum was some researchers were not comfortable with that. They were much more used to exploring and presenting results and not wanting to get too much on the train, as Bill would put it. Bill Thall's metaphor was if this was like a train going down the track, you can sit on the train and sort of document everything that's going on, including the bridge that's out up the track, and continue to document that and go off into the chasm. And that's your project. Others may be more on the side and more willing to intervene and tell the conductor that maybe it's time to stop the train or do something because everyone's going to be killed, and actively intervening in that sense. And actually, it was quite a good metaphor that was used many, many times to say, are you actually wanting to be part of the study and doing something actively, or simply observing and documenting and let the system go as it may? We had 6 studies across the country. The one in BC is about integrated primary community care in Fraser Health, and Charlotte's going to speak to that. The Prairies looked more at leadership in the context of shared services design, the support services in the province of Saskatchewan. Ontario and Quebec both look at alternative models of primary care using family practice models, and are going to attempt to sort of compare their findings. The Atlantic node, which was Capital Health in Nova Scotia and Eastern Health in Newfoundland, both look at engagement. Capital looked more at physician engagement, and Newfoundland looked more at patient engagement. And the national node looked at leadership in the context of patient safety, quality, and appropriateness of care. So it wasn't so important to us looking at this across the country what the content area was. It was more important what is the leadership that goes with that content area, and that was the focus. We used, because we had multiple case studies, we used comparative multiple case study analysis. And our method was really looking much more at how do we build explanation as we go through the analysis over time, because this was a fairly lengthy project, as I've just discussed, which is why we had a bit of a time series analysis, what was happening at different cycles of PAR as well, over the course of 3 to 4 years. And we used in vivo software, both at the node basis and also for the cross-case analysis. So we were quite triangulated, if not quadrangulated or quintangulated. I think we sort of looked at the analysis of the data in many, many different ways, both quantitatively and qualitatively. Now, KT, I said it is a big deal, and it goes back in many years in terms of concept. Kaplan came up with this two communities theory idea, and that was, social scientists like myself and many of you, and policymakers live in different worlds. Well, it was true in 1979, and it's still true. In fact, maybe it's more true. But even in more to that, we have multiple communities. Within the community of the health system, there's a whole spectrum of clinicians and decision makers and policymakers and politicians and the patient. And in the research community, there are many forms of researchers, qualitative and quantitative, and there's many specialties within that. When you start adding all those communities together, you have a multiple community reality that you have to deal with. And we don't always align in our thinking or our culture or our values or our reward systems or a lot of other things. So that concept of communities thinking and acting very differently is alive and well, and that was something that we had to basically overcome, which I think the PAR approach was quite effective in doing as well. This is partly why KT is difficult to understand. I'm not going to read this, but you can see it's a very good definition. It's very complex. It's very comprehensive. But what does it actually mean in day-to-day practice to the decision maker? A more succinct definition is this by Graham. It's really about turning knowledge into action, and encompasses both knowledge creation and application, which gets back to the need that we need to fill this gap between not just creating the knowledge, but how do you actually apply it in day-to-day practice. I like to think of KT a little bit, even in more simple terms, is how do you get knowledge into the head, hands, and heart of people? Head in the sense of you actually need to have some intellect and basis in the literature evidence that what you're doing is appropriate to your situation. Hands, that you actually have that practical application, and heart, that your heart is really there, and this is what you really believe in terms of values. And I think we're actually missing the mark more in the heart part and the hands part than the head part. The head part's always been the emphasis in KT. I think we need to shift that. It was a key component of the proposal stage. We would not have got funding approval if we hadn't had a KT plan. So it's a very integral part of this. So they made you think very early on about what are you going to do with the knowledge during the project, which is integrated KT, what happens over the course of the project, and what are you going to do at the end. And PAR is actually a very nice approach to use the concept of KT because it's actually occurring in real time. So our difficulty, to some extent, though, was not a common understanding of what PAR was in some cases, and therefore, how do you actually apply the principles of KT during the course of action research over 3 cycles? So that was one of our lessons learned as well. InspireNet, which stands for Innovative Nursing Services and Practice Informed by Research and Evaluation Network, is a BC network that is really looking at nursing knowledge and research in the province of BC. It's funded by Michael Smith and has an extremely useful and comprehensive e-COP platform, which we were fortunate enough to partner with because we didn't have money to develop our own platform for KT, which allowed us to have a repository for information, allowed us to do WebExing, blogging if we wanted, a way to communicate, and a lot of utility that, in fact, we didn't end up using. And I'm going to come to that in a moment. End of Grant KT, there's a number of us that are going to be presenting at conferences and writing up different aspects of the nodes across the country. That still has to be coordinated. That still falls to me as a KT strategy lead to do. So we have a number of things to do that we're obviously not going to complete by the end of March, but we'll follow on from that. The McMaster Health Forum is another part of our KT plan. Dr. John Lavis, who's the Canada Research Chair in KT, runs a forum in McMaster and has been part of the project since its inception, and a place where we're going to be bringing our findings to an invited group of 20 to 24 people who have been handpicked across the country, who are going to bring their own perspective to our findings. So through Graham, he has and will be distributed the cross-case analysis findings so that he can distill that into an evidence issues brief, as it's called, to distribute ahead of the meeting and allow people to sort of understand what the project was about, bring their own perspective, and as importantly, do something about that when they go back to the workplace. So that's going to happen next month in Hamilton. Some of our insights were it took a long time to start up, as I mentioned. The study was a long time, so it was difficult to maintain teaminess. People move on. In fact, we unfortunately lost one person. He died from Saskatchewan due to a chronic illness. Some people were promoted, some people moved on, some people kind of just moved away. Our team went from 20 to 32 over the course of the project, which means we had to do some team building. But teaminess was important. But with the mobility, which is one of our findings in the health system, we actually had a bit of a microcosm of the reality of the health system in our own project, which is quite interesting in terms of the challenges that are faced in the system that I think we also mirrored in our own microcosm. FaceTime was important. If we had more money to do that, we would have. We found that people were keen to sign on, and I think part of that is because not every project gets funded right away. In fact, in CIHR, you're lucky if you get funded the first time, let alone the second. Often it's the third or fourth time. So I think we had people signing on, not really expecting to be part of this, and when they were, it's like, uh-oh, now what? Because the expectations changed very quickly for all of us. Geography and travel took a lot of time, and it was very, very expensive. You can imagine bringing people literally from coast to coast together as often as we could. Difficulties around what is PAR anyways. We had researchers who were much more in the quantitative world and the qualitative world, so we had to spend some time talking about what does PAR mean generally, but also specifically in the context of this project, which then also led to what is KT. And given the earlier definition, I said there are all kinds of understandings and misunderstandings of what KT is and isn't that we had to come to terms with as a team over the course of the project. But we did learn from that, and the result, I think, speaks to that as well. And the fact that we signed on to InspireNet late was also another factor. I think people were getting kind of a little worn out in terms of the KT role, and our expectations of them to sign on to yet another site were maybe beyond what was reasonable at that point. Nonetheless, some of us did, and we used it to the extent that we could, given the timing and interest and availability of our team, and made as optimal use of that as we could. But I think I'd do that differently next time as well. Some lessons learned. The formula for attaching researchers to decision makers is excellent. There needs to be more funding in that respect. Again, an emphasis on not just the what we're finding, but how do we implement that. And there's lots of opportunity for researchers and decision makers to work together as a team to help implement innovative solutions to real leadership challenges as we move forward. It's absolutely critical that we have central office or central coordination for a project, and that was exemplary in our case through our Center for Health Leadership and Research, and Diane Vandergoot in particular. Diane, I want to acknowledge you, who really was the operations lead for the day-to-day work and all of the organizing around the Secretariat, research design, KT, steering groups, a ton of work that had to be done that was actually quite invisible in the project, but nonetheless I want to acknowledge. And also the Office of Research, who was extremely helpful and instrumental in making sure that ethics got done, Colleen and Vanessa and others in the office, in terms of tracking the finances, because when we're tracking $800-some thousand over 4 years across the country, it's a bit of a challenge. But we're actually going to balance out at zero. We're landing where we want to be. And again, some lessons learned, expect the unexpected. We had some money that came back, which was good because it allowed us to put that into other places. The downside was not all the work got done that we had expected ought to have been done because not all the cycles of PAR were accomplished. And there are reasons for that. It's not a criticism, but it's just a fact of working in real life research. We need to keep the team tight. Again, interest wanes over time. We had size creep. We went from 20 up to 32. I'm not quite sure why that happened, but it was not a bad thing. It was a good thing. It just meant the team got bigger. I would recommend, I think as many of us would, keep it as short as we can because of those waning interests. And life changes. People move on. I have to stop here. My last slide. Why are partnerships like this important? Well, there's a number of reasons. One, it orients both the researcher and decision-maker community to their different perspectives, and that's extremely important. We don't want to live in two different worlds or communities. We need to come together more. So these kinds of partnerships that are funded is an extremely important way to do that. More needs to be put in that area. It encourages each other to appreciate each other's worldviews and values. It enhances collaboration and cooperation, and it helps us to understand issues together, including power. When you're in a research project, often the decision makers defer to the researchers because they have the research knowledge to do things. On the other hand, much of what we need to do is not from the researchers, it's from the decision makers. So we learn to appreciate where each other come from and level that power playing field, if in fact there is one. And it enables us to learn from each other in very transformative ways. So it's been a great project. I've learned a lot. We've learned a lot. The product that we're getting out of this as it's rolling up is absolutely exceptional, and we're going to hear a lot more about that in March the 4th in Hamilton, and hopefully it'll translate right into practice, and all of you, all of us will see some result of that massive effort across the country. So that's it for me, and I'd like to turn it over to Charlotte now to talk about the BC node specifically.
Thanks, Ron. So that was a good overview of the cross-case research, and what we're going to do now is we're going to zoom into the BC node research, and then we're going to roll up the BC findings into to the key messages that came out of the overall project. So basically we took 3 snapshots using a set of questions and semi-structured interviews, and I also attended a number of meetings, all with the Fraser Health Authority, the Ministry of Health, and the Division of Family Practice in Chilliwack. So I was visiting each of the 3 groups that were in our project, and actually seeing in real time with my own eyes what they were telling me in the interviews. So that was really valuable. And this is a diagram of our plan schedule. So the 3 snapshots were taken about 6 to 7 months apart, so that we had this study done over time. There's a little bit of time slippage in some of the dates there, but basically the data was shared back with the participants and the decision makers at the end of every cycle. And they were then able to take those findings, work them into their work, work them into their discussions, work them into their work plan, and actually use the findings as we went along. And then it just kind of grew from that. So for instance, when they received the cycle 1 findings, they were able to integrate that. When I talked to them again in cycle 2, that was evident that that was happening. And when I was thinking about what to include here, I thought, well, I have a mountain of transcripts, and our report is over 117 pages long, so I thought, what will I pull out of here? And I thought, what I want to share with you is what the participants thought was important and of benefit to them. So that's where we'll go. And we started with a question about context. And as Ron pointed out in his slides, we did have to deal with a high rate of turnover throughout the study. People were changing jobs, people were changing roles. A couple of them left their organization altogether. So we were always onboarding new people into the research as participants. And so that was not a bad thing. It was just something that took some time. It also affected the participants' availability too. So they were a moving target, but it was fine. And during the course of this research, of course, we had a provincial election, which diverted some of the attention and energy of our participants, and also introduced for a while an element of uncertainty. So if the government changes, will this program continue? So there was that was definitely at play for a few months there. There was some restructuring in Fraser Health, which for some called into question some mixed messages about, well, are we integrating or are we getting more siloed? So there was lots of things to think about in terms of leadership and what was going on just in the real world as we worked with this. They had lots of other things to deal with. During this research, Fraser Health was actually given 150 days to address their congestion problems. You might recall you heard on the news that people were being triaged in Tim Hortons, that patients were in the hallways. So a lot of their energy was diverted into dealing with these. But again, it afforded lots of great examples for leadership in action. People, by the end of it, were saying, I'm feeling burned out, not from the research, but just from everything that's going on, all the things I have to be aware of and consider. And some of them were starting to feel a little bit of disconnect. So in the early part of the project, everyone was quite excited, and it felt like the right thing to do to integrate primary and community care. By the middle of the project, people were starting to go, this is a lot bigger than we first thought. The scope of this is expanding, and by the end of it, people were starting to say, wow, I'm getting tired. I'm going to need to recharge somehow. So that was some of the things in the context of what we worked with. And we asked people about leadership capabilities and attributes. And when we looked at the findings, we thought, well, these seem to sort out into some things which we might be able to put in a column called skills, and some things which we might be able to put in a column called characteristics. And some of these things were threads that ran through the entire project, and other things were more important at various stages of the implementation of the integration. And participants were asked about leadership roles and how they were perceived. And so that middle paragraph there definitely talks about the instability. And I remember going to one meeting and there was some eye rolling and references made to, well, who will be the executive of the week that shows up at our meeting? So because of the constant turnover, it meant that some people were stepping back a little bit and feeling a little bit disconnected from the whole process, just because there was some inconsistencies in messaging and in attendance and things like that. So when we look at the last paragraph there, the participants identified a key leadership role as creating conditions to remove barriers. So all the way through, we were able to see what they thought about what people wanted leaders to be doing, what people thought they as leaders needed to be doing at various points in the project. We asked them about impetus for this kind of change. Well, what keeps it going? What breathes life into it? And people said, well, we're all kind of doing what we can at various points, and because we were working with the 3 groups, things were not always moving forward in lockstep. So there was some consideration about the system, sequencing, what was appropriate when, what could be done when, and so these are other things that leaders needed to be thinking about all the time. What could they do? When could they be doing it? And how did it fit? I'm going to talk a little bit more later on about the distinction and importance of the terms. But as you see there, people talk to me in terms of coordinated leadership. They used the phrase collective leadership, and they talked a lot about courageous leadership. So these are going to come up a little bit later, but I wanted to just sort of flag them now. And we also asked them, well, what helps in this kind of a change initiative? What are the enablers? And they told us quite a few things that were helpful and kept it going. And the bullet there who says leaders who are bridges between groups, the boundary spanners and translators. I saw this in action many times, and I came to appreciate how important that was. So there would be people who would attend one organizational meeting, and they would constantly be giving very good advice about, well, if we want to send this message to the physicians, we need to word it this way. If we want to be talking to this group, I think it would be better if we use this approach. So their advice was, I think, very important in this whole project. And I really appreciated the work they did, the effort that they put forth to make sure that the groups were communicating and hearing the messages in the right way. That all speaks to trust and strong relationships and making time for important conversations. So at the beginning, it wasn't rushed, and people were telling me that they really appreciated having the time carved out for them to be able to talk about what was going to be expected of them and the changes that were coming and what they needed to draw on for themselves. There was a safe place for many of them where they could voice concerns, ask questions, and they appreciated that. Along with that, it was also important to know when to stop and when to get to action, because one group said to me, well, we don't normally work like that, and we found it a bit frustrating. People wanted to create all these terms of reference and build a structure, and as physicians, we diagnose and we treat. We get to action much faster than people do in an organizational environment. So I thought that was an interesting point. And as I said before, they believed it was the right thing to do. And I heard that phrase many, many times in the beginning. So to me, that spoke about their values. So not only were the leaders making sure that the values were aligned throughout the organization, but they were also tapping into the people's personal values. This is the right way to go about it. This is the right thing to do. This is important work. C is for challenges, and there were many of them as we went along. And the lack of solid evidence, whoops, I just got ahead of myself here, sorry. Nope, there we go. So the lack of solid evidence that this is making a difference was really key too. They had to deal with, of course, the competing priorities and initiatives that I mentioned earlier. That also tied in with their time and energy limitations. Many times throughout the project, interviews were scheduled and rescheduled a couple more times. They were committed to doing them, but we had to be very flexible in dealing with these challenges. I already mentioned the uncertainty around the provincial election, and at some point, some people felt that they were being collaborated at, not with, and that phrase again came up a few times. So when they go into a meeting, did they feel like the decision was already made and this was just a token meeting, or were they really feeling that their contributions were going to be valuable? So that was an important thing to think about for some of the leaders when this came up, and they went, oh, do I do that? You know, when I call a meeting, is it perceived that the decision is already made? Another thing about balance, so the inability to hire and bring in new blood seems contrary to the turnover, the problems related to turnover. However, the leaders were saying that we've got hiring restrictions on, and so I can't backfill positions, and so people are just doing 2-3 roles maybe at a time, and I can't bring in new blood. But at the same time, the attendants and the decision makers' roles were turning over fairly quickly. So it seemed like a bit of a dichotomy there. And the last bullet there is fairly important, and I'll speak to that again a little bit later on. One of the big challenges is that people were having a great deal of difficulty, in fact, sometimes it was impossible to get the data together to actually provide solid evidence that there was positive effects coming out of this, that there was good statistics. So the data existed. Often it existed in little pockets all over the place, and because of privacy concerns and just software integration, it remained piecemeal, it remained siloed, and it couldn't be aggregated and looked at as one big picture. Another thing that came up, which I thought was very interesting, is that our legislation actually contradicts and divides rather than integrates and connects. So people were telling me that, well, it's great, we can collaborate up to a certain point, and that's all wonderful, but then at some point our act, whether it's the Hospital Act, the Mental Health Act, the Children and Families Act, at some point those acts will separate us and our mandates will dictate us to do different things. So that got in the way a little bit. Leadership development and succession planning, that was a challenge. People don't have time. People don't have the funding to invest in that kind of thing. So the learning takes place individually and experientially rather than in a formal program. Funding and resourcing, obviously a challenge. And one person said, I'm concerned that if the funding is pulled for this integration project, it will just disappear. I'm concerned that we chase dollars for some of these initiatives rather than actually thinking about, should we continue with this and what are the reasons for doing so? I'm going through fairly quickly because I'm keeping an eye on the clock too. We asked about learning, and so again, they don't have the time, they don't have the energy to take on a formal project or program. So most of the learning happens on the job in real life if they have time to reflect on it. And that was another thing that at least 2 of the people, the decision makers that I interviewed, said to me at the end of it. They said, I'm really going to miss these conversations because this has been the only time that I've actually stepped out of my role and really thought about what leadership means to me at this point. So I think that was a very valuable piece that came out of here. And again, the boundary spanners who translate the messages and the information so that other people can actually hear the message and act on it in their own way, make it their own. And the last two bullets about underestimating the time, Ron touched on that too, required for a large system change. And allotting time for learning to work together and learning to speak each other's language, because people need time to adapt. Most of them will, and they'll do it very well, but they need to do it on their own pace. One other point about learning is that we found that the best practices and operational learning was very well documented. There was manuals and pamphlets and all kinds of documents created, but leadership learning went unrecorded and often unnoticed. When I met with the participants after cycle 1, I used this image because I thought it illustrated very well that although something can be explained, in this case it was the vision in cycle 1, you think people are seeing the same thing, and in effect they are, but they're not seeing exactly the same thing. So I think that's a good question for leaders. So what assumptions am I making about what people are understanding about leadership and our work together? The system barriers, that stood out to be a really, really big obstacle for many people. The fact that they can't share information due to privacy policies, or they just have simple software interface problems, or it just doesn't exist, or maybe it exists, but they don't have the resources to actually read the data, translate it, and be able to share it with others in a way that that will help them make decisions and come to conclusions and design strategies. So this, the need for evidence was mentioned many, many times, along with the difficulty in getting data to provide evidence for measurement and evaluation. And I didn't have permission at this point to use this, but I did bring this article around. So here's the headline in the Times Colonist that says, BC's health data management is a mess. So our participants are not the only people who are aware of the challenges in data collection. Again, the constant churn that we had caused some challenges for some. On the other hand, it did bring new people into the research. It does bring fresh ideas and maybe people who aren't feeling quite so burned out. So there's two ways to look at things. Here's something that really stood out too, and I think will come into play during the whole cross-Canada research, is that physicians are retiring now at the same time as many baby boomers are starting to begin to develop chronic health problems and need to draw on the resources of the health system more and more. And new doctors who are coming on, surprisingly, aren't interested in working 70 hours a week. And at one of the meetings I had with the Division of Family Practice in Chilliwack, one of the doctors said, well, what's wrong with them? You know, sort of tongue-in-cheek. Why wouldn't they want to work 70 hours a week? So that is a reality that we're going to have to face. Communication, of course, is a theme that ran through the entire research project, making time for dialogue, listening to hear, resolving conflict, and asking for feedback were some of the things that the participants said was very important to them. And along with communication, there was cultural differences. So I mentioned the fact that we had groups that worked in an organizational setting. We had physicians who are essentially small business people who look at things differently. And so if one person is describing the blue triangle and they think that the other person is hearing the blue triangle, but they're really not, that's a problem. And so again, it comes back to, as leaders, what assumptions are we making about our communications and how do we need to check that out? So we're going to kind of take all that and wrap it up in a very small package and look at how these findings kind of supported the key messages that came out of the cross-Canada research. So Graham, you'll recognize these, and I understand that there's been a couple more that have emerged, which maybe you could speak to a bit later. So the key message number one is leadership matters, and Leaders need to be able to translate these kinds of findings into their own context and apply them in their own authentic leadership role. And I think it was John Maxwell, though I'd have to look up the quote, said, "Everything rises or falls on leadership." So it's important. The key message number 2 was capacity, and the sustainability of the health system is at stake here. And the indications are that maybe we don't quite have the leadership capacity in the system that we're going to need moving forward. The next message is about complexity and system thinking, and our systems are increasingly complex and interconnected. And so that is something that we're going to have to be considering, working with, and meeting those challenges. Message number 4, coming together. So discouraging silos and creating the environment where people can have shared visions, common goals, and co-ownership is something that we may need to be working on. And I took a little bit of liberty here, Graham, and added in the C, leadership, here too. So as I said, people use terms like collective leadership, collaborative leadership, coordinated leadership. And in an offline conversation with a participant following one of the meetings, I commented on that because these terms had come up. And the person said to me, and I asked about distributed leadership, and they said, no, that doesn't resonate for them because they think of distributed leadership as more dispensed leadership. So there's a shift in personal responsibility. So there's lots of nuances around the terminology that we use. And there's the references that we used in this. So I'll turn it over now to Graham, actually, to see, do you have anything that you'd like to add about the key messages? Because I know there was a couple more.
I don't know how much time you have left. I'll just say 2 things. One is that one of the elements of contextual elements of the study is that at no point did we actually define leadership. And we actually did that at the beginning of the study, that leadership is the capacity to work with others to achieve a constructive purpose. And so the whole idea of leadership was, how do you coalesce energy and activity are aiming at a common goal or a common purpose, which of course in this case is a quality health system. The second aspect of the study that I just want to emphasize is that leadership actually has no meaning except in the context of change. If you have a very stable world, a stable environment, you don't need much leadership. You can just rely on management to organize it, plan it, and carry out the predictable operations that need to be used. Because healthcare is in such a turbulent environment, what we wanted to do was to look at the challenges of leadership in an environment that has lots of good operational management. The healthcare system has very strong operational management. That's why you get quality results when you go into a hospital, or quality results when you go to your doctor, because the predictable functions of the health system are well managed. Change, however, making something better, is a completely different skill set. And that's why this study was so important. We wanted to chronicle the tension that exists in the system between people who have responsibility for both. And the more turbulent the system is, the more responsibility shifts for operations to change. And you have to be very skilled at change, or you get results where the energy wanes over the period of a study. There becomes, how would I say it, peripatetic and wasteful actions that take place, and ultimately the change focus just dissipates and you have nothing. So 2 or 3 findings that we did find in the context of this that Charlotte didn't mention. One is, well, she did mention it, I'll just re-emphasize one of them. One is the leaders out there are exhausted. They're exhausted because there are so many structural factors that they have to fight against to get people to work together. And you saw a lot of them articulated in that particular case. We saw that in all the cases where people were saying, I just don't have the energy to do this anymore. Every time I take on a new project, I'm exhausted at the end because I have to fight so many battles so constantly on behalf of the patient. All the structures, the cultures that are mitigating against that change. The second is the idea of collective leadership, distributed leadership, shared leadership, whatever you want to call it. That idea that you have to work as a team of leaders to create change, which you do in a system, really challenges people's personal notions of leadership itself. They see it as something that the heroic individual does by themselves and imposes it upon others. It doesn't see it as a shared responsibility, and therefore attitudes about personal autonomy, willingness to actually, the skills to actually be collaborative, because there is a skill to being collaborative that some people just have never mastered. There's senses of, maybe I have to give up some of my personal autonomy to share leadership with other people. It means you have to listen a lot instead of tell a lot. You all know what those things are. But they really challenge the culture of leadership that is traditionally operationally based. And so to get the kind of leadership you need for change is a huge challenge within a system of this nature. It was mentioned that physicians are important, and it is absolutely vital to understand in the system that physicians basically block change if they don't agree with it. And they legally and in the role they play have that capability. So if you are not engaging physicians as partner leaders, and if they don't have the skill of collaborative leadership, then you're hooped before you even begin. And I could probably go on, but those are a few of the highlights that we're finding through this study. By the way, leadership capacity. Ron said it was a bit of a challenge. It's huge a challenge. A recent study showed that 40% of our academic health science centers in this country, things like UBC Hospital working with Vancouver Coastal Health, 40% of them say that they do not have the leadership capacity to meet the challenges of the future. They say that right up front. That's massive. And they do agree it's a skill deficit, not a numbers deficit.
I think we'll stick around for questions if anybody has any. Just noticing that it's almost 1 o'clock, so if people do have to sneak out, I wanted to give them an opportunity. And I wanted to thank Ron and Charlotte so much for that really interesting presentation, and useful, I think, for people to hear about how a large-scale project like this can unfold and challenges, etc. So I think lots of people can take something away from that. So I want to thank them, but I don't know if you have anything afterwards that you have to run away to, but if you can stay for questions, that would be really great. Thank you so much.